I walked into the boardroom 10 minutes early, and the first thing the CEO said to me was, "Excuse me, the interns sit in the back." A few people around the table chuckled softly, the kind of polite laughter people offer when they want to stay on the good side of whoever's in charge. I smiled, nodded once, and quietly took a seat near the middle of the long walnut table instead. The room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, the same scent that had lived in this building for decades. Outside the tall windows, the Chicago skyline was still gray with early morning fog, but inside the boardroom the lights were bright and sharp, illuminating a dozen faces that didn't bother to hide their curiosity. I didn't recognize most of them. New executives, new advisors, new energy. That happens when a company grows fast. People arrive who never knew where it started. The CEO, Daniel Carter, stood at the head of the table scrolling through something on his tablet. He looked younger than I expected, maybe mid-40s, wearing a navy suit that probably cost more than my first car. He didn't look at me again after that first comment. To him, I was already categorized. Another intern. Another assistant. Another person who didn't belong in the real conversation. I placed my leather folder on the table in front of me and folded my hands on top of it. The folder was old, worn around the corners, the kind of thing that looks out of place in a room full of glossy laptops and glass tablets. Across from me, two men in tailored suits were discussing quarterly projections while a woman beside them organized printed reports into neat stacks. No one asked my name. No one asked why I was there. Every few seconds someone would glance in my direction, just long enough to confirm their assumption.
Intern.
Assistant. Maybe someone who brought coffee earlier. I didn't mind. People often reveal far more about themselves when they believe you're invisible. I watched Daniel move around the room greeting board members with confident handshakes. His voice carried easily across the table, smooth and practiced, the voice of someone used to being listened to. "Today's vote is going to change everything," he said at one point, tapping the edge of the table for emphasis. A few heads nodded. Someone murmured agreement. I noticed the quiet excitement in their expressions, the kind that comes when people think they're about to close a very profitable deal. Daniel finally looked toward me again as he reached his seat. "Just make sure the interns stay quiet during the meeting," he said to the executive assistant beside him, not even lowering his voice. The assistant followed his gaze toward me for a moment before offering a small apologetic smile. I returned it calmly. The meeting hadn't started yet. And in rooms like this, the beginning is rarely the most important part. I sat there quietly, hands resting on that old leather folder, listening to the low hum of conversation, the clink of coffee cups, the confident tone of people who believed they understood exactly who belonged at this table. What none of them seemed to realize was that I had been part of this company long before most of them ever heard its name. I remained seated while the rest of the room slowly settled into the rhythm of a meeting that had not yet officially begun. Laptops opened. Coffee cups shifted across polished wood. Someone tested the large presentation screen mounted on the wall. A quiet mechanical hum filled the room as the projector warmed up. Daniel Carter stood near the head of the table speaking with two men I recognized from recent press releases. One of them was the new chief financial officer, a tall man with silver hair and a voice that carried easily through the room. "If the vote passes today, the acquisition moves forward immediately," he said with quiet excitement. Daniel nodded confidently. "By next quarter, we'll be part of something much bigger." The words echoed across the boardroom, and several people exchanged approving looks.
Growth.
Expansion. Opportunity. Those were the kinds of words that sounded impressive in press conferences and shareholder letters. But they were not the words that built this company. I rested my hands calmly on the old leather folder in front of me and listened carefully. For a moment, no one spoke directly to me, which gave me the freedom to watch. That is something most people underestimate. When others believe you are unimportant, they stop guarding their conversations. Across the table, the woman organizing reports finally finished stacking the documents and began distributing them one by one. When she reached me, she hesitated for a brief second before placing a thin packet in front of me as well. Her smile was polite, though slightly uncertain, as if she was not entirely sure whether I was supposed to receive one. I thanked her softly. The packet outlined the agenda for the morning meeting. Financial summaries. Strategic alignment. Final vote regarding the proposed sale of Whitmore Technologies to a multinational firm headquartered in California. I had read enough corporate documents in my lifetime to understand what that really meant. A company changes hands. New leadership arrives. Old stories quietly disappear. I glanced around the room again. Many of the faces here were unfamiliar because most of them had only joined the company within the last 5 years. That was around the time everything began changing. New investors, new executives, faster growth, larger offices, people who spoke about the company as if it had always existed exactly like this. They saw the glass walls, the modern furniture, the national reputation. They did not see the garage where the first prototype had been assembled on a folding workbench. They did not see the long nights when the future of the company depended on whether a single client returned a phone call. I remembered those days clearly. I remembered the sound of rain hitting the metal roof of that garage while Richard sat beside me sketching designs on yellow legal paper. Back then, we measured success differently. Not in quarterly projections, but in whether we could pay our employees on time. I returned my attention to the boardroom as Daniel finally took his seat at the head of the table. He adjusted the microphone slightly and looked around with the confidence of someone who believed he controlled every outcome in this room. "All right, everyone," he said, clasping his hands together. "Let us get started." Several people straightened in their chairs. The quiet conversations faded instantly. Papers stopped moving. The meeting that would determine the future of the company was about to begin, and not a single person in the room seemed to realize that the quiet older woman they believed was an intern had been listening to every word. I watched Daniel Carter adjust the microphone and begin his presentation with the confidence of someone who believed the room already agreed with him. The large screen behind him lit up with a clean corporate slide showing revenue charts, projected growth curves, and a bold title that read Strategic Acquisition Proposal. He spoke clearly, pacing his words like someone who had rehearsed the speech several times. "Whitmore Technologies has grown tremendously in the past decade," he said while clicking to the next slide. "But in today's global market, scale matters more than ever." Several board members nodded as he spoke. One man leaned back in his chair with his hands folded across his chest, studying the screen carefully. Another woman typed notes quickly into her laptop, occasionally glancing at the financial numbers projected on the wall. I remained still, my hands resting quietly on the leather folder while Daniel continued outlining his plan. According to him, the company had reached what he called a pivotal moment. The California firm interested in purchasing Whitmore Technologies had promised expanded resources, international reach, and faster innovation. The language sounded impressive. It always does when lawyers and consultants polish every sentence. But beneath the smooth presentation, the real message was simple. Someone else wanted control. Daniel stepped closer to the screen and pointed to the projected valuation number displayed in large white text. "This acquisition offers our shareholders an extraordinary return," he said. "The kind of opportunity that only comes once." The chief financial officer beside him added several remarks about operational efficiencies and strategic alignment. Their voices blended into the steady rhythm of a carefully coordinated pitch. The boardroom had grown very quiet. I noticed the expressions around the table changing slowly from curiosity to cautious approval. Numbers have a way of doing that. They can make almost any idea seem reasonable. Daniel continued explaining how the transition would unfold over the next year. Leadership restructuring, department integration, a new executive oversight structure. Each sentence sounded calm, professional, and certain. Yet as he spoke, I found myself remembering something very different from the polished story displayed on that screen. I remembered the first time Richard and I received an order large enough that we had to work through the entire weekend to fill it. I remembered how we packed the equipment ourselves, carefully labeling each crate before loading it into a rented truck. Back then, there were no consultants explaining strategic alignment. There were only 2 people and a long list of problems that needed solving. The boardroom lights reflected softly across the polished table as Daniel finally finished his presentation and looked around the room with a satisfied expression. "That concludes the overview," he said, setting the remote control down beside his tablet. "Now we can move to discussion before the shareholder vote." A few quiet conversations began immediately. Chairs shifted slightly. Someone asked a question about long-term licensing rights. Another board member asked about employee retention during the transition period. Daniel answered each question smoothly. He looked relaxed, almost relieved, as if the hardest part of the meeting was already behind him. From where I sat, I could see the confidence in his posture, the certainty that everything would unfold exactly the way he expected. I listened carefully to every word, the old leather folder still resting beneath my hands, and wondered how many people in that room would look surprised when the vote finally began. The quiet discussions around the table continued for several minutes as board members reviewed their documents and exchanged cautious opinions. Daniel Carter leaned back slightly in his chair, clearly comfortable with the direction the conversation was moving. Confidence has a certain posture to it. Shoulders relaxed, voice steady. The kind of calm that comes from believing the outcome is already secured. I listened while the chief financial officer explained projected earnings under the proposed acquisition. The numbers sounded impressive when spoken out loud. Revenue expansion, market penetration, strategic consolidation. Words designed to make complicated decisions feel simple. Across the table, one of the board members adjusted his glasses and asked about long-term brand identity. Daniel answered without hesitation. The Whitmore name will continue, he assured him. It carries too much recognition to remove. Several heads nodded in agreement. I wondered if anyone in the room truly understood what that name meant. Companies are often described in numbers. Revenue, stock price, market share. But the real weight of a name comes from something much older than financial reports. My mind drifted back to a small garage on the outskirts of the city nearly 30 years earlier. The building had once been used for auto repairs before Richard rented it for a few $100s a month. The roof leaked when it rained, and the heater barely worked during the winter. I could still remember the way our breath fogged the air while we worked late at night assembling the first prototypes on a wooden workbench. Back then, Whitmore Technologies was not a company. It was an idea that refused to disappear. Richard believed in it from the very beginning. He used to sit at the kitchen table with sheets of graph paper spread out in front of him, drawing circuit layouts while cold coffee sat forgotten beside his elbow. I would watch him work for hours, listening as he explained the design improvements he was trying to achieve. We did not have investors. We did not have a board of directors. What we had was determination and a quiet promise that if the idea worked, we would build something lasting. I remembered the first employee we hired after the company finally started gaining traction. A young engineer who had just finished graduate school and took a chance on two people operating out of a garage. Richard insisted on paying him before paying ourselves that month. People come before profit, he said. If they believe in what we are building, the rest will follow. Those words stayed with me long after the company moved into its first real office space. Over the years, the building grew larger, the projects more complex, and the staff expanded beyond anything we could have imagined in those early days. Yet the heart of the company had always remained the same. At least it had until recently. The quiet sound of a chair shifting pulled my attention back to the boardroom. Daniel Carter was standing again, reviewing one final slide that summarized the acquisition timeline. His voice carried the tone of someone presenting a finished conclusion rather than an open question. With approval from the shareholders, he said, the agreement can be finalized today. Several people began organizing their notes in preparation for the vote. Papers slid neatly into folders. Tablets were closed. The atmosphere in the room felt settled, almost routine, as if the decision ahead was merely a formality. I looked around the table once more, studying each face carefully. Many of them were intelligent, experienced professionals. Yet none of them seemed to realize that the story they were discussing had begun decades before any of them arrived. And the person who had been there from the beginning was still sitting quietly among them. The room grew quieter as the discussion slowly faded, and the meeting moved toward its final stage. Daniel Carter glanced at the agenda in front of him, and then looked around the table with the calm assurance of someone who believed every detail had already been settled. If there are no further questions, he said, folding his hands neatly in front of him, we can proceed to the shareholder vote. A few board members nodded. Someone slid a pen across the table. Another person closed a laptop with a soft click. The atmosphere shifted from conversation to decision. This was the moment they had been building toward all morning. Daniel reached for a thin folder beside his tablet and opened it carefully. For the record, he continued, speaking with formal precision, this vote will determine whether Whitmore Technologies accepts the acquisition proposal submitted last month. He paused briefly and scanned the room before continuing. Only registered shareholders are eligible to participate. Several heads turned slightly as people prepared their paperwork. A few of the executives glanced down at printed documents that listed ownership percentages and voting procedures. I remained still, my hands resting quietly on the worn leather folder that had been sitting in front of me since the meeting began. The assistant who had distributed the agenda earlier stepped forward with a stack of ballots. She moved around the table carefully, placing one sheet of paper in front of each eligible participant. When she reached my seat, she hesitated again, the same small uncertainty crossing her face. For a moment, she looked toward Daniel Carter, waiting for guidance. Daniel followed her gaze and glanced at me briefly. His expression carried the same casual dismissal I had noticed earlier. The interns do not need ballots, he said lightly, already turning his attention back to the board members seated beside him. The assistant nodded politely and continued around the table. I watched quietly as each shareholder received their voting sheet. Some people studied the paper immediately. Others placed it beside their laptops while they waited for instructions. The process appeared orderly and predictable, exactly the way Daniel seemed to prefer it. I opened my leather folder slowly, careful not to draw unnecessary attention. Inside were several documents neatly arranged in transparent sleeves. Old papers, but important ones. At the top of the stack rested a certificate printed on thick ivory paper with a gold embossed seal in the corner. The document had been signed years earlier during a quiet afternoon in a small law office downtown. I could still remember the moment clearly. Richard had insisted that the company remain protected no matter what happened in the future. Businesses grow, he told me at the time, sliding the document across the desk for my signature. Leadership changes, but the foundation should always stay in the hands of someone who remembers why it was built. I lifted the certificate carefully and placed it on the table in front of me. The paper rested there quietly beneath the bright boardroom lights. Across the room, Daniel Carter continued explaining the voting procedure, confident that the outcome would follow the plan he had spent weeks preparing. Around him, the board members listened attentively, unaware that one small detail in the room had already changed the direction of the entire meeting. The certificate rested quietly on the polished table for several seconds before anyone noticed it. In a room filled with screens, tablets, and glossy financial reports, a single sheet of thick paper did not immediately draw attention. Daniel Carter continued speaking with the same steady confidence, explaining how the voting process would move quickly once all ballots were collected. Each shareholder will mark their vote clearly, he said while gesturing toward the papers already distributed across the table. Our legal team will record the results immediately after. Several board members nodded and began reviewing their ballots. One man adjusted his chair slightly while another leaned forward to reread the summary of the acquisition proposal. The meeting had reached the point where everyone believed the outcome was simply a matter of paperwork. I watched the assistant complete her circle around the table and return to her seat near the wall. Only then did the chief financial officer notice the certificate resting in front of me. His eyes paused on it for a moment longer than usual, curiosity interrupting his routine focus. He leaned slightly toward the table, studying the document more carefully. The gold seal reflected the overhead lights in a quiet shimmer. "Excuse me," he said after a moment, his voice careful but curious. "May I see that document?" His question shifted the attention of several people nearby. Daniel Carter stopped speaking mid-sentence and turned his head toward the sound. For the first time since the meeting began, his attention rested fully on the table in front of me. I slid the certificate gently across the polished surface toward the chief financial officer. He lifted the document carefully and began reading the text printed across the page. The room fell unusually quiet while his eyes moved line by line. Corporate meetings often carry a low background noise of movement and whispers, but now the boardroom had grown still. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning system above us. The chief financial officer straightened slowly as he finished reading. His expression had changed in a subtle but unmistakable way. Not shock exactly. More like the sudden realization that an assumption had been incorrect. He cleared his throat quietly. "Daniel," he said, holding the certificate slightly higher so the light fell clearly across the seal. "You might want to take a look at this." Daniel reached out and accepted the document with a polite but impatient motion. For a brief moment he glanced at the paper without much interest. Then his eyes moved back to the top line and paused. His expression tightened slightly as he read more carefully. The words printed on the certificate were simple and direct. Majority shareholder ownership of Whitmore Technologies. The name beneath that statement was written in clear legal type. Margaret Whitmore. Around the table, several board members leaned forward, trying to see the document from where they sat. No one spoke immediately. Daniel looked from the certificate to me and then back again, as if checking whether the name printed there might somehow belong to someone else. The quiet confidence that had filled the room earlier was beginning to shift. The vote had not started yet, but the direction of the meeting had already begun to change. Daniel Carter held the certificate in his hand for several seconds without speaking. The confidence that had filled his voice earlier was gone now, replaced by a quiet pause that no one in the room seemed prepared for. Around the table, several board members leaned forward, trying to read the document from a distance. The chief financial officer was the first to speak again, his voice measured and careful. "It appears that Margaret Whitmore holds the majority shareholder position." His words settled over the room like a sudden shift in the air. A few people exchanged glances. Someone quietly pushed their chair back an inch, as if trying to understand what they had just heard. Daniel looked up from the certificate and studied my face more closely than he had at any moment since the meeting began. The casual dismissal from earlier had disappeared entirely. Now there was something else in his expression. Uncertainty. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said slowly, the name sounding unfamiliar on his tongue as if he had only just connected it to the company's history. I nodded once, calm and unhurried. "That is correct." For a moment no one spoke. The silence in the boardroom felt heavier than before, filled with the quiet realization that something important had been misunderstood. Daniel placed the certificate gently on the table between us and straightened his posture, clearly trying to regain control of the situation. "I was not aware that you planned to attend today's meeting," he said, choosing his words carefully. His voice was polite now, but the confidence behind it had softened. I folded my hands together on the table and met his gaze evenly. "I try to attend meetings that involve decisions about my company." A few board members shifted in their seats. The sentence was not spoken loudly, but its meaning traveled across the room easily. Daniel glanced toward the chief financial officer, then toward the legal counsel seated near the far end of the table. The lawyer had already begun reviewing the certificate with professional focus, his finger tracing the printed lines that confirmed the ownership structure. "The document appears valid," the lawyer said after a moment. "It clearly identifies Margaret Whitmore as the majority shareholder." Several people exhaled softly, as if a piece of information had finally clicked into place. The acquisition vote they had expected to complete quickly was no longer a simple formality. I watched Daniel absorb the information, noting how his earlier certainty had been replaced with careful calculation. Corporate leaders are trained to adapt quickly when circumstances change. Yet even the most experienced executive cannot ignore a majority shareholder. Daniel cleared his throat quietly and looked around the table again. "In that case," he said, forcing a composed smile, "it would be appropriate for Mrs. Whitmore to receive a ballot as well." The assistant near the wall quickly retrieved an extra voting sheet and walked it across the room. She placed it gently in front of me with a respectful nod that had not been there earlier. I thanked her and rested my hand on the paper without marking it. Around the boardroom the mood had shifted completely. The same people who had spoken confidently about the acquisition minutes earlier were now studying their documents more cautiously. Conversations had stopped. Everyone understood that the direction of the meeting now depended on a single vote. And for the first time since I entered the room, every person at the table seemed to recognize that the quiet woman they had mistaken for an intern had been listening from the beginning. The ballot rested quietly in front of me, while the rest of the room waited. No one spoke. A few minutes earlier, the conversation had been confident and fast-moving, but now the boardroom felt different. Careful. Attentive. The kind of silence that appears when people realize the outcome is no longer predictable. Daniel Carter straightened the stack of documents beside his tablet and cleared his throat softly. "We will proceed with the vote," he said, his tone controlled but noticeably more cautious than before. Around the table, several board members picked up their pens. Papers shifted. Someone adjusted their chair slightly. Yet no one rushed. Everyone seemed aware that a single decision carried far more weight than they had expected when the meeting began. I looked down at the ballot in front of me. The question printed across the top was simple and direct. Approval of the proposed acquisition agreement. 2 boxes waited beneath the question. Approve.
Decline.
Years of work, decades of effort, and the future of an entire company reduced to 2 small squares on a sheet of paper. I rested my pen against the table for a moment without marking either option. Across the room, Daniel watched carefully, though he tried not to make it obvious. Corporate leaders learn quickly how to observe without appearing impatient. Still, the shift in his posture was clear. Earlier, he had spoken as though the decision was already complete. Now he waited like everyone else. I thought again about the garage where Whitmore Technologies had begun. The long nights Richard and I had spent refining ideas that seemed impossible at the time. The employees who joined us when the company was still uncertain and fragile. The quiet pride on Richard's face when we moved into our first real office building. Those memories were not numbers on a projection screen. They were the reason the company existed at all. Around the table, several ballots were already being marked. The assistant moved carefully between chairs, collecting each sheet once it was completed. When she reached my seat, she paused again, the same respectful patience she had shown earlier. I lifted my pen and placed a single mark inside one of the 2 boxes. The motion took less than a second. Yet as I placed the ballot face down on the table, I could feel the attention of nearly everyone in the room shift toward that small piece of paper. The assistant picked it up and added it to the growing stack in her hands before returning to the front of the room where the legal counsel waited to record the results. Daniel folded his hands together again, watching closely as the ballots were counted one by one. The process was quiet and precise. A name was confirmed. A vote recorded. Another ballot placed on the table. When the final count was finished, the lawyer looked up from the documents and adjusted his glasses. The room had become completely silent now. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than before. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair. "What are the results?" he asked. The lawyer glanced once more at the final tally before answering. His voice was calm and professional. "The acquisition proposal has been declined." For a moment, no one reacted. The words simply rested in the air, settling slowly across the table. Then several board members shifted in their seats as the meaning became clear. The company was not being sold. The plan Daniel Carter had spent weeks preparing had ended with a single vote, and the meeting that began with quiet assumptions about who belonged in the room had reached a very different conclusion. For several seconds after the lawyer announced the result, the boardroom remained completely still. The words had been spoken clearly, yet the meaning took a moment to settle across the room. The acquisition proposal had been declined. Not postponed. Not reconsidered. Declined. Daniel Carter remained leaning forward in his chair, his hands still folded together on the polished table. The confident rhythm he had carried through the meeting earlier had disappeared. In its place was the quiet composure of someone recalculating a situation that had changed faster than expected. Around the table, a few board members exchanged brief glances. Some looked down at their papers, as if confirming that the process had been followed correctly. Others looked toward me, their expressions no longer uncertain about who I was. The lawyer gathered the ballots neatly and placed them inside a folder before speaking again. "The result has been recorded in the meeting minutes," he said calmly. "Whitmore Technologies will remain under its current ownership structure." The sentence sounded simple, yet it carried the weight of the decision that had just been made. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair and exhaled quietly. He turned toward me once more, studying my face with a far more careful expression than when the meeting had begun. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said respectfully, choosing his words with deliberate calm. "It seems I owe you an apology." I met his gaze, without hurry. "For what exactly?" I asked. He paused for a moment before answering. "For assuming you were someone else when you entered the room." A faint smile crossed my face, not unkind but steady. "That happens more often than you might think," I said. A few quiet chuckles moved around the table, easing the tension that had built during the vote. Daniel nodded slowly, acknowledging the moment without argument. Corporate leadership requires the ability to recover with dignity when circumstances shift.
He seemed to understand that now.
I gathered the documents from my leather folder and placed the certificate carefully back inside its sleeve. The meeting had reached its natural conclusion. The decision had been made. As I stood from my chair, the movement drew the attention of the entire room. I looked around the long table once more, recognizing that most of the people present had only known the company during its years of success. They had not seen the beginning, and they had not carried the responsibility of protecting what came after. Whitmore Technologies was never built to be sold quickly, I said calmly, my voice steady in the quiet room. It was built to last. No one interrupted. Even Daniel listened without speaking. I closed the leather folder and rested it lightly against my side before turning toward the door. Just before leaving, I paused briefly and looked back across the table one final time. "One more thing," I added gently. "The next time an older woman walks into a boardroom, it might be worth asking her name before deciding where she should sit." With that, I walked out of the room, leaving behind a board of directors who now understood something they had overlooked at the start of the meeting. Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who built the place everyone else works in.